Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activist, Learn Languages, Make a Difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Liebre Lopez, and today we're going to tackle the issue of why multilingualism is the new normal and the old one, despite the fact that many still assume that monolingualism is the norm. Let's see how and why. As you can see on the screen, there are two ways in which we can talk about what's the norm or what's normal. There is first the statistical sense, as in the majority of people speak either one or more languages. And then there is the ideological sense, what has come to be the social convention, what has come to be believed by the majority of people, regardless of the facts on the ground. So let's see first how the picture looks statistically. So statistically, we can see here on screen that monolingual people, meaning people who know only one language, make up 40% of the world population, whereas multilingual people, including bilingual, trilingual people, and those who speak 5 or more languages, make up the rest, meaning 60% of the population. In that sense, multilingualism is the norm. Multilingualism is normal in the statistical sense. As you can see, bilingual people are 43% of the world population. So there are more bilinguals already than monolinguals. And then on top of that, there are other multilingual people, including trilingual people, who make up 13% of the world population. And finally, people who speak 5 or more languages, who are less than 1% of the world population. Now, this is the statistical sense. Let's go now to the ideological sense. What counts as normal in the conventionalized sense? Well, here we can rely on Michel Foucault, who in his Discipline and Punish analyzed this notion. And he says, well, rather than speaking about normal as something we take for granted, we ought to speak about normalization, which emphasizes the fact that what is now considered normal is the end product of a century-long process. So normalization as a process involves the construction of an idealized norm of conduct and then a system that rewards and punishes individuals for conforming to or deviating from this ideal, respectively. Normalization is a form of disciplinary power which emerged in the 19th century and came to be used extensively in institutions such as military barracks, hospitals, asylums, schools, factories, offices, etc., foreshadowing the social structure of many modern societies. How does this apply to our discussion of monolingualism and multilingualism? Well, Foucault tells us that the assumption we nowadays have that monolingualism is the norm stems from a process of normalization and then the implementation of a system that rewards individuals for conforming to monolingual expectations and punishes other individuals for deviating from those very expectations, saying, oh, now you're using a word in French. This is an English class, stick to English, etc. And of course, the fact that this process of normalization as a form of disciplinary power emerged in the 19th century obliges us to have a look at its intractable link with colonialism. Foucault says normalization consists, first of all, in positing a model, an optimal model that is constructed in terms of a certain result. And the operation of disciplinary normalization consists in trying to get people, movements, and actions to conform to this model. The normal being precisely that which can conform to this norm, and the abnormal, that which is incapable of conforming to the norm. In other words, it is not the normal and the abnormal that is fundamentally and primary in disciplinary normalization. It is the norm. That is, there is an originally prescriptive character of the norm, and the determination and the identification of the normal and the abnormal becomes possible in relation to this positive norm. So say a certain nation state in the 19th century adopts the linguistic ideology of monolingualism to, quote unquote, unite the members of the nation, meaning to homogenize those citizens. Now, from this, monolinguals come to be the norm, and everything that deviates from monolinguals, meaning multilingual people, come to be framed as abnormal or exceptional, so that over the centuries, the citizens of those nation states internalize this ideology and take monolingualism to be the norm and multilingualism to be the exception statistically, even when, as we've seen, the statistics show otherwise. And then this conventionalized ideology becomes so pervasive in society that people no longer conceive of multilingualism as being the statistical norm, because conventionally it has been abnormalized, and vice versa. Now they come to see monolingualism as the norm when it was never statistically the norm. It just happened to be a linguistic ideology that had been normalized, meaning made normal by the dissemination and implementation of this linguistic ideology of monolingualism. And here we can have a look at further resources on this question, such as Multilingualism, which is a very brief article by Mahendra Verma, and Multilingual is Normal, which is a relatively brief anthology featuring plenty of testimonies by multilingual people about their own language journey and the highs and lows of being a multilingual person in a world that continues to assume that monolingualism is the norm and that being multilingual is somehow exceptional deviant. So first, Mahendra Verma. Of course, I'll put the links in the description down below so you can all access these sources. Now, first, let's analyze multilingualism by Mahendra Verma. So you can see in the abstract, the author argues that multilingualism is the norm in the world, meaning the statistical norm, rather than the normalized assumption, whereas monolingualism is the statistical exception. Language and nationalism, language dominance, language loss, and shift are characteristics of multilingual nations, in particular those with a colonial history. As we saw, colonialism is at the root of the normalization of monolingualism as the linguistic ideology that continues to be pervasive in our society. That comes to be dominant in the 19th century and continues to be pervasive in our society. And here, Verma talks about two different levels, the nation on the one hand and society and communities on the other. Let's talk about the nation. Verma says, well, we have first monolingualism as a linguistic ideology that is interactively linked to the implementation of the nation state, particularly since the 19th century. And the fundamental tenet of this ideology is that a single race is equivalent to a single culture and a single language. And from this, we obtain the following paradox: the fact that most of the world is multilingual, yet we still have a monolingual bias. We, as a society, by and large, still assume that monolingualism is the statistical norm and multilingualism is the exception. For instance, a clear-cut example here is the USA. The US is highly diverse in the number of languages that are spoken, over 300. And yet, the US continues to be depicted and represented as a monolingual country in English, even though, as we know, not even the Constitution recognizes English as a national language. So the assumption in general, according to Verma, is that countries in the West are monolingual, and then multilingualism is the province of some third world countries that are riddled with dialects and an overlap of different linguistic varieties. In fact, multilingualism is, as we said, the norm in the world, whereas monolingualism is the exception to the rule. All societies, says Verma, are bi or multilingual and heterogeneous. And here Verma includes both linguistic diversity as well as dialect diversity. He says dialect diversity alongside a standard language is a valid example of a kind of multilingualism. What are some of the most multilingual countries, you might be wondering? Well, here's a ranking obtained from ethnologue.com that has Papua New Guinea as the most multilingual country in the world with over 800 languages, and then Indonesia, Nigeria, India, the USA, China, Mexico, Cameroon, Australia, and Brazil. In particular, Verma highlights the fact that cities like London, as a result of the arrival of migrants and refugees in the second half of the last century, meaning the 20th century, are estimated by Baker and Eversley to have approximately 300 languages. And now the second level, societies and communities. Here Verma talks about societal bilingualism, which is the fact that the majority of people will have at least two languages or dialects in their speech habits, for instance, Hindi and Punjabi in the Punjab, and also about polyglossia, whether it is triglossia or diglossia, etc., which is the allocation of functions and distribution of languages across various domains. Say, for instance, at home you speak Spanish, but at school you use English. Languages in society could also be, of course, a source of ethnic and linguistic conflict, as it has been already witnessed in the case of Bangla in Bangladesh, or Welsh in Wales, or Euskera in the Basque Country, Catalan in Catalonia, etc. At any rate, he identifies 4 factors that contribute to the speaker's abandonment of the first language, which are economic incentives, educational opportunities, lack of government support, and discrimination, prejudice, stigma against those minoritized varieties such as Euskera, Welsh, Catalan, etc. And his final thoughts are devoted to modes of multilingualism in general and bilingualism in particular. And he talks about additive multilingualism as a form of language pedagogy, but that already includes implicitly another form of multilingualism or bilingualism, that is subtractive bilingualism or subtractive multilingualism. Let's have a look at the differences. So the idea with additive bilingualism, as you can see on the screen, is that it develops when both languages and the culture associated with them bring complementary positive elements to the child's overall development. Whereas in the case of subtractive bilingualism is the opposite. It's characterized by the loss or erosion of a home or first language and culture. Now, of course, our bilingualism or multilingualism can be both additive and subtractive at the same time. Additive in some aspects and subtractive in others. Say, for instance, you learn Hindi at home and English at school. It can be additive in the sense that you can use both languages as part of your linguistic repertoire to your advantage. And it can be subtractive in the sense that you might have experienced a certain language attrition in the language you spoke at home because of the fact that you never use it outside of that realm. So these are simply 2 extremes of a bilingualism or multilingualism continuum. And I will argue that most of us who speak more than one language experience both additive and subtractive aspects in our multilingualism. And the second source is Multilingualism is Normal, which is the title of a recent anthology published by Cate Hamilton. I incidentally contributed with 1 chapter that you can read in this volume. And this is a source I suggest you consult after having read Verma's article and having watched many of the videos in this channel, because it will allow you to engage critically with some of the categories that are not problematized in the volume, such as quote-unquote native speakers or quote-unquote foreigners or foreign language. Other than that, I think this is a marvelous volume because it allows us to normalize multilingualism, to through the voices of multilingual speakers, show to the world that there is nothing exotic, nothing exceptional, and of course, nothing deviant about speaking multiple languages. Rather, it is statistically the norm, whereas monolingualism, once again, is the exception. And so, in the introduction, I like the part when Cate says, every human does language in their own way. Let's celebrate our languaging. And here, languaging has to do with the communicative practices that involve speech, as opposed to language as a system, separated from context and history and agents of that language. So let's celebrate our languaging, our everyday communicative interactions. Join the conversation in the hashtag multilingual is normal on social media, especially, and this you can do every year, on the International Day of Multilingualism, which takes place on March 27th, which is now approaching, so bear this in mind. The date engraved on the famously multilingual Rosetta Stone. Spread the word in many languages that multilingual is normal. And I think it's important to conclude this video by explaining why is this discussion relevant. Whether monolingualism or multilingualism is the norm is relevant because the assumption that monolingualism is normal is just the tip of the iceberg. It's just a symptom of a much broader and structural problem, which is the fact that colonialism, even after the fact, even after the territories that were colonized have gained independence, continues to pervade our everyday interactions and discourse under the form of coloniality, which means the logics and legacies of colonialism, the way in which our culture is still very much influenced by a colonial mindset. And the idea of monolingualism is part and parcel of that, because it participates from the assumption that a race is equivalent to a culture, which in turn is equivalent on a one-to-one correspondence with just one language. And this could not be farther from the truth, as shown in this video. So as I conclude in my own essay for this book, just like one cannot espouse democracy without rejecting fascism, one cannot embrace the fact that multilingualism is normal without at the same time rejecting colonialism, from which enforced monolingualism emerged as a legitimizing linguistic ideology. I hope this video has been useful for you to understand and problematize this phenomenon. Please let me know what you think in the comments down below. And as always, thanks for watching.